Hey folks, welcome to the class that will be April the 14th. Here are the questions for this week. I'll leave this here and then of course I'll bring it back at the end of the video in order to show you what's going on there. But let's switch this around in the meantime. Make sure we're in the right spot. Hey there, how y'all doing? Hope all is well with you. There we go. So, how you doing? Hope you're doing well. It's actually spring break week. I'm trying to do a little bit of my to-do list in the earlier part of spring break so I can have a little rest at the end of it. I hope you're finding a way to rest and relax, and hopefully your family is well in the midst of this crazy crisis. But before we go on, let's hit some housekeeping details. I'm having a look at grades, and there are a handful of people I'm still not getting anything from, and I'm hoping I start to get something there. I've reached out to folks. I'm hoping that they begin to turn things in, and plainly the reason there is I don't want to give out an F. And unfortunately, if people stay in the class and they don't do anything, then we're going to be in a bad situation come the middle of May. My hope is that people turn things in. Now, if you're looking at a 0 on any of these sets of questions, please go ahead and do them. Turn them in. I will grade them. The 0 that's been set there, ladies and gentlemen, I would be happy to see you resubmit those assignments, and I'd be happy to regrade them and put the grades up higher. So please, if there's a 0 there, I hope you'll still do them. In the long run, we're getting close to the end of this. I know that sounds like a bizarre sentiment, but I look at the bottom of the page. I see that we have one today. That's meeting number 12, technically speaking, for April 14th. And then as I flip the page, only 3 more class meetings to go. The one for Manifest Destiny, that'll come in the week of April 21st, followed then by the 1850s and the sectional divide that drives us to the Civil War, and then lastly, the fighting of the Civil War in the 1860s. So, my point is this: we're near the end. By the time we get to the middle of May, this class will be wrapped and done. Please stick with it. Please continue to do good work. The vast majority of people are turning in great stuff, and it's a handful of folks, as I said, who I'm trying to get a hold of and trying to get stuff from. But otherwise, we are boogieing quite well. I have on hand my slides. I have one of the images I want to talk about as we go through our discussion today. I also have a copy of Voices of Freedom on the ready, so hopefully you do as well. Ready to go? Okay, let's go. Today's deal is the Second Great Awakening. Now, you're saying to yourself, I think we've already had one of these. We have. Good memory there. Back in the day when we had classes in a classroom, that's a long time ago, we had a First Great Awakening, early part of the 18th century, and it featured significant people like Jonathan Edwards, who gave us the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Remember, you're going to roast in hell if you don't, at some point, get better with God. We also had George Whitefield, highly exuberant, charismatic, over the top, birthed the Bible out of himself, that guy, and everyone's like, take my money, take it all. And Whitefield and Edwards were part of a movement that in essence said, listen, America, all of you individually need to increase your overall morality and your relationship with God. Now, that movement and those two gentlemen came from Europe. That was a reform movement that we kind of got the second portion of because it transferred over the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Now, the Second Great Awakening is different in a couple of ways. Number one, it's not from Europe. This is one of our own organic movements. We are trying to make things better within the United States of America. And that is our primary difference right there. The First Great Awakening said the problem is the individual's relationship with God. The Second Great Awakening is really concerned with our society, our community, how we as an America are doing, and how we can perhaps make things better here in America and make ourselves more in line with what the country's supposed to be if we look at the language of it and the lofty idealism of it. Now, the Second Great Awakening is not something where you're going to say, well, it began definitively here and ended definitively there. That's not the way these things work. It's a religious movement, and so it really catches fire in the early part of the 19th century, and for us is going to phase out of existence by about 1850, 1855. As we look at things, I have chosen 3 topics to talk about. Number 1, temperance, the movement to lessen alcoholism in America. Number 2, the abolitionist movement to try and end slavery. And number 3, the movement to try and bring equality to women around the nation. There are other fields we could have talked about.
For instance, prison reforms big during the period. The overall idea of American education is just coming into a lather here as far as trying to understand how schools work and how we educate children and what the American model is going to look like. So if those are areas that you're interested in, there's certainly a lot of area you could explore there. But for our purposes, we're going to start with temperance. The temperance movement is aptly named. If you've never heard that word before, temperance, or the root of it, temper, let's make sure we understand it. Temper, to lessen, to decrease the amount of. The people in the temperance movement want Americans to drink less. Are Americans drinking a lot? Oh, by golly, they are. The average American is drinking something on the notion of 7 or 8 gallons of hard alcohol per year. Now, that does not keep in mind a steady diet of things like beer and wine and cider, which would have been quite popular, particularly as one headed out into the frontier. Now, to their credit, to excuse this a little bit, there isn't a lot of other options to drink. A person doesn't have the option of, say, sodas or energy drinks or fruit drinks for that matter, or bottled water. Alcohol was often seen as being beneficial, not just because it did what alcohol does, but also because a lot of people thought, well, it's a pretty safe thing to be drinking. It's going to kill off all the bad things in it. So a lot of people drank. What the problem really equated to, though, was one of gateway. Today we use that phrase and we say marijuana is a gateway drug. And what we mean by that is that people go from marijuana into perhaps harder substances, more serious narcotics. Alcohol was seen as the gateway to the other problems of the 19th century. We can attack alcohol and therefore end poverty, homelessness, violence, gambling, adultery, broken homes, orphans, widows, you name it. That was the assumption, that if you really attacked at its root the alcoholic problem in America, that you could, in one fell swoop, whoosh, get rid of all of those other societal problems. The people most concerned with doing this are, generally speaking, middle class, upper class individuals who are working in urban areas. So the reason I want to phrase this way is to talk about the temperance movement as a cultural phenomenon, but also to understand that it has very deep economic and political clash to it. So to outline this the right way, the temperance movement is pushed by primarily middle and upper class individuals who are Whigs, right? Remember this political movement we had last week, the Whigs? They believe in self-improvement, picking yourself up, being a better American, working hard. All of those things are very much the Whig ideology. Now, the backbone of that Whig idea of self-improvement is Protestant religion. There is a Protestant zeal in this movement that says none of you have a chance of doing well against alcohol unless you have one key factor at your back, and that is God. You have to have the support of God. If you have God, all is possible. If you do not have God, none of it is possible. Now, the audience for my individuals trying to make temperance happen is generally a very different set than the people speaking. I said a second ago that the people speaking are Protestant, middle and upper class, Whigs. The audience could not be more different. Generally working class, lower class, Catholic, and particularly Irish. The people who are associated with the drinking in America are the newest wave of immigrants. Those immigrants are arriving from Ireland. Part of this is the Irish potato famine and the lack of food there. Part of it is just a general flow out of Ireland. If you look at the early 19th century, there's only one country in Europe that has a significant downward population trend, and it's the Irish. They lose about 1 million people out of their 9 million of population to the United States and another 1 million to the rest of the British Isles. In other words, people are simply leaving Ireland to look for opportunities. They arrive in America. They are perfect factory workers in the eyes of the system that we have constructed. They are generally associated, though, with a great deal of drinking. Now, to be fair to the Irish, Americans drank in great amounts before the Irish arrived. But our thought process is that, oh my gosh, this is so much worse now that the Irish are here. So the Irish are seen as being the real cause of the alcoholic problem. What that means is you're going to have a second Great Awakening reformer. Let's make it a person. This person over here, and a lot of the time it's a woman, so let's go with that. A woman, Middle class, upper class background, Whig political ideologies, probably lives on the suburban, the sort of outer portion of the city, and she's going into the heart of the city to go on the door of some Irish immigrant in order to try and throw this idea of limiting the amount you drink. Now, my audience is generally working 11 to 7 hours a week. They are absolutely fed up with the system that they've walked into in America, and they see alcohol as being an escape from that and part of a cultural background that says, hey, I like to have a drink, leave me alone. The person who's trying to stop the drinking is going to say, we just need you to drink less. But that message is going to get lost a lot of the time in the reverberation of the fact that the person presenting it is so different from the audience. This Catholic middle or lower class worker down here is going to look at this Protestant Whig upper class person, and right off the bat there's going to be a disconnect that comes from the idea that, frankly, you don't know my life. Don't tell me what to do. So a lot of the temperance movement gets people to, yes, stop drinking, but much of it is seen as being part of a greater trend of what's called nativism. Nativism is an anti-immigrant feeling that is going to be pushed against the Irish. It's kind of an American tradition in a horrible way, in that the newest generation of immigrants are often posed as being the bad guys in the eyes of the prior generation of immigrants. And the newest generation of immigrants here are the Irish. And they are the ones who were going to say, hey, you need to knock this off. There's all sorts of evidence of this nativism out there. There's this very interesting trend. You can find signs that would say, no Irish need apply. That was the catchphrase. And sometimes when they didn't want to bother to write out the whole acronym, they'd go N-I-N-A, Nina. And the Nina next to the job posting was basically like, we're in need of help, but not if you're Irish. So the Irish are the people who are going to get a lot of the push on this here. Who's defending the Irish? Well, let's go back to last week for a minute and find our friend Andrew Jackson. The Democratic Party gets a lot of votes from these Irish individuals. And so the Democratic Party has a platform, a belief system that goes with what we'd call moral freedom. And the Democrats are going to say, we believe that a person should be free to, in this case, have a drink, and in another portion of our discussion tonight, own slaves. And that's not something that you should get in the way of. So you're going to get a very different vibe from the Democratic Party than you do from the Whig Party. Okay, but the issue of temperance to try and slow down the drinking in America works on a level. Americans' alcoholic consumption goes down, but it continues on. That's why we later on, if we were to continue into the 20th century in this class, we would see the prohibition movement of the early 20th century eventually get alcohol banned in the 18th Amendment. Okay? A sip of soda for a moment. Thank you very much. Okay, next issue. Abolition. This, keep in mind, is a very touchy issue. 2 weeks ago, we spoke of the notion of antebellum sectionalism. And that sectionalism talked about the fact that there are northern and southern attitudes towards slavery. Slavery is a state issue. After the Revolutionary War was won, each of the states made a decision to either accept or ban slavery within their state. It's not a federal issue. In other words, the federal government does not pretend to have the power in 1830, for instance, to go into a southern state and say, slavery's over, give it up. Okay, that's not something that we believe is a part of the federal government's power. So the way to get rid of slavery is tricky. It can't come, at this point, through federal government power. You're going to have to get it done some other way. People are going to try to help escaped slaves escape. That is to say, to underground railroad them quickly across the north. And that works to an extent, but keep in mind, by the time of the Civil War, you're talking about an African-American enslaved population in the South of 4.5 million people. That kind of a policy is not going to work very well for that. You'll also see people writing journals. There's abolitionist newsletters. This guy, William Lloyd Garrison, puts out the most famous one called The Liberator. And it's a great publication. Unfortunately, if you're a Southerner, you'll probably never see it. A lot of the Southern states banned abolitionist literature. You're going to hear speeches. A lot of the times it's firsthand experience. It's people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman. But that's not something that Southerners, again, are going to see. So what are you left with then? You're left with trying to find a way to abolition that is tricky at best. You're trying to morally persuade people. That's the only way this is going to work. How do I morally get people to believe in this message in order to get them to understand that as a group of people, we shouldn't want this? So a lot of the message of the Second Great Awakening, which is a religious we need God message, fits nicely with the abolitionist movement. So in a moment when we look at our two documents, we'll notice that both of them have strong religious echoes to them. Okay? Before that, there's a practical attempt to try and get this to work that we should mention. And I mention it in my second bullet here, so let's have it for a moment. What's called the American Colonization Society. For about 10 years, the ACS, a private Protestant charitable group, raises money in America, buys a stretch of land in Africa, you can still see it today, it's the country of Liberia, and ships African people from America, both free and formerly enslaved, to Liberia. If you remember back again when we had classroom days, we read a document from Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson said about race in America that he didn't think it was going to work out, that we as a nation needed to find some way to figure ourselves a future where there was only one race. And his answer was to remove the people of African ancestry to somewhere else. The American Colonization Society's response to that is, yes, President Jefferson, you're right about that. The place where we're going to remove people to is Africa. Now, I am saying move them to Africa. The American Colonization Society would have said move them back to Africa. And that's a very subtle difference, but let's make sure we understand that that is a difference. In the mindset of the people of the early 19th century, an African person would be happier, more comfortable, more able to live their best life, to take a modern phrase, in Africa, even if that is an individual that did not come from Africa, right? You could be an enslaved person in America in 1820, and you are 6, 7, 8 generations removed from anyone who has ever been to Africa. So it's a very interesting ideology that says we're going to move these people. But the Colonization Society goal, or society's goal, was to end slavery one purchased slave at a time. We'll raise enough money, we'll go to a southerner, we'll say, how much? Here you go, here's your money. Freed slave, freed slave, freed slave. Does that work? Marginally. About 8,000 people over the course of a decade. Not a great success, but the sort of success where you look at it and you say, that's all right. But if you're going to ban slavery, what we'll figure out later on in this course is that you really have to have the power of the federal government behind you. It's the only thing strong enough to really enact that kind of major change, right? 30-second segue or tangent, if you will. Look at the coronavirus, right? Staying at home. That's something that's come down from the states, not the national government. Whatever you believe about federalism, this virus has been an excellent example in it, in the sense that some people are going to say the federal government should take the step of saying, all of you stay home. But the president is saying, I don't believe in that. I don't have a political philosophy that allows me to control the states that way. Those are state-level decisions. California, do what you want to do. Nevada, do what you want to do. So that becomes a tricky federalist question. Same with slavery here. How do we feel the states should act versus how should the federal government act? Okay. Briefly, I want to look at the two documents I've included here. One of them is the pro-slavery argument. Okay. The author here writes about why slavery is justified. And there's a few reasons for this. And I want to talk about each of them. Number one, the author would say to you that there is an innate inferiority, African versus white, that there is a clear inferiority and that slavery acknowledges that. Number two, the author is going to say that the Bible allows slavery. And that's not untrue. If you look at the Old Testament of the Bible, you're going to find plenty of instances of slavery. And Southerners in this period are quick to grab the Bible, because they would say Northerners are quick to grab the Bible. You want to grab your Bible, Northerner, and say, hey, God doesn't like slavery. Jesus believes in the freedom and equality of all. I will pick up my Bible. I will go earlier in it. I'll hit the Old Testament, not the New, and I'll find you plenty of examples. So the citing of the Bible becomes a real back and forth. The last reason, and this is the main portion of what the author provides us here, is that a system of equality, of everyone for themselves, doesn't work that well in a society. And to sort of support that argument, let me quote the author in the last line of the passage. A state of independence always begets more or less of jealous rivalry and hostility. A man loves his children because they are weak, helpless, and dependent. He loves his wife for similar reasons. The point being that the author wants us to understand that slavery allows Southerners to help African people in their life. Now, I know you're shaking your head. You're going, my gosh, is he trying to rationalize this? No, I'm not. I'm just trying to make sense of what this man said. I don't believe in what he said. Please don't think that, for goodness sake. But the author would like you to think about what's happening in the North. The free labor system in the North does not allow any kind of a structure for personal improvement. Slaveholders in the South are increasingly of the opinion that slavery isn't the necessary evil that Thomas Jefferson said it was in the 1770s and 80s. Oh no, it's a morally reputable, reliable program. It allows people who wouldn't ordinarily be able to improve themselves a system of improvement. Southerners see slavery as a vessel for the civilization of African people. That's what they would say to you. And that's what that passage holds. Now, the other document, the one from A Fugitive Slave, 216, is a great document for us, pardon me as I adjust here, because the author is going to put forward the idea that that argument of improvement is completely off the charts. It's wrong. Okay? The argument here is a fellow named Joseph Taper, who is himself an escaped slave, who's living in Canada. Why Canada, Holiday? Well, Canada offered free land and free assets, in this case it's a team of oxen and a wagon, to people who escaped slavery and lived in Canada. This is a program that the British have put together to try and populate the yet unpopulated portions of Western Canada. Not Western like Vancouver, British Columbia, but sort of north of where states like Indiana, Illinois are, trying to get individuals to live in territories of Canada that weren't populated yet. And this is a group of individuals who are looking for land. Brilliant strategy. Okay? Taper writes in a letter, I have enjoyed more pleasure within 1 month here than in all my life in the land of bondage. Right? Take that, prior author. Take that. I enjoy my life here. My wife and I and self are sitting by a good and comfortable fire. In the prior passage, he says, my son is in school. I'm going to leave him in school till he becomes a scholar. You know, I pray that Queen Victoria have a wonderful life. I pray that she live on into heaven and enjoy herself. And what Taper puts forward is, don't listen to the Southerners. Don't listen to this civilizing aspect argument. Complete malarkey. Life is better away from the slave system. You and I are sitting there going, yes, Holiday, I understood that. But that's something that Southerners were not arguing, keep in mind. All right, last passage. Sip of soda, pardon me. Okay, women's rights. Here's what you have to understand. At this point in American history, let's call it the 1840s, there are not very many Americans who believe that women's rights is a legitimate movement. In a sense that if you got 100 people in a room from various American backgrounds and geographic regions, you said, all right, here we go. How many of you think that we need to lessen the amount of alcohol consumption in this country? You would get a fair number of yeses on that one, right? That was the temperance movement we started with. If you then went on to say, how many of you believe, raise of hands, how many of you believe that the federal government should end the practice of slavery in each of the slave states? You're not going to get a lot of support there. Maybe 5 to 10 people out of 100. The movement towards the abolition of slavery will catch fire in the 1850s and 60s, but not yet. If you then followed it up with one last question, you said, all right, hands up, how many people believe that women deserve the same political, that is to say the vote, legal, that is to say inheriting land, inheriting money, owning land, rights as men? How many people believe in that equality? 1 out of 100, maybe 2. You're not going to get very many individuals. So this is a movement that is out there on the fringe of the movement of the Second Great Awakenings. It is considered to be quite a different set of ideals. Its workers are primarily women who, for that matter, have kind of cut their teeth or made their reputation in the temperance movement And then after that, in the abolitionist movement, in fact, the people who organized the first women's rights conference in American history in 1848 at Seneca Falls, they know each other because they hung out together at the World Anti-Slavery Conference the prior year in London. And so they had planned this women's rights conference as a secondary event to continue on with their missionizing and their reform movements. The meeting itself is about 100 attendees, mostly women, but men as well. And at the end of it, they put forward a statement called the Declaration of Sentiments. Now, I like Eric Foner. He does a nice job in this book. It used to be that a copy of the Declaration of Sentiments was in here, but in the newest edition, it's not. What's up with you, Foner? You took out the wrong document, my friend. Okay? Now, if you're interested, Declaration of Sentiments, that's the document, you'll look it up. It is beautiful, and I wish it was still in this book, because it models itself after the Declaration of Independence. In the same way that Thomas Jefferson writes, we believe that all men are created equal. In the Declaration of Sentiments, they say we believe that all men and women are created equal. And then in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson runs this list of the nasty things done by King George III. In the Declaration of Sentiments, the women say, here's all of the things done by men to women over the course of their lives and history over the millennia that has been bad. And therefore, Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence says we have to be independent. And the women in the Declaration of Sentiments are going to say, and therefore, we need the right to vote. We need the right to legal and political equality in this state. You have to bring that to us. Now, the general national consensus is that this is not a serious topic. You're not going to get newspaper editors around the country to get behind this. In fact, they pan it or dismiss it on a large national level. A rather unfortunate event. But the topic is out there. It's being discussed. There are two documents I attach here. One of them has Catherine Beecher, and the date, the page there, I beg your pardon, is wrong. It says 240. I think it's 237. I apologize for that. Beecher is going to represent the more traditional view of women. She doesn't like to see women up there on a stump, on a stage, talking about the moral reform movement. She thinks that's a man's job. Beecher thinks that women should do the more natural roles of a womanhood. That is to say, domesticity, that is a housewife, and also teaching. You should do those two things if you want to have an impact on the world. The second document is new to this edition, so I've not taught it in the past, but it's a rather interesting document from Lucy Stone, who's a well-known reformer, and her soon-to-be husband, Henry Blackwell. And they commit themselves to a set of ideas in the sanction of marriage that make up a huge challenge against the way people viewed traditional women's rights. So it's a great little document, so have a look at that one as well. Let me bring back for you, ladies and gentlemen, the questions. Here they are. I'll finish with that. Again, if there's anything I can do, let me know. Keep turning in assignments. I know normalcy is hard to find, but let's try and get as close to it as possible. Take care, folks.